4. Canary Girls. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British government encouraged women to register for war service jobs to keep up with production demands and so more men could volunteer to fight. Thousands of women answered the call, and by the war's end, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million women were working at munitions factories throughout the UK. The hours were long and conditions were dangerous for these munitionettes, who performed grueling physical labor, operated dangerous machinery while exhausted, and exposed themselves to toxic chemicals, including asbestos. Factories were extremely loud, ventilation was poor, and the work was repetitive. The environment made it difficult to focus on the task at hand, yet each employee was held to specific production quotas and quality standards. Each position came with different risks, and some jobs were more hazardous than others. One of the most dangerous positions involved filling shells with TNT. The hair and skin of women who came into regular contact with the explosive turned yellow, earning them the nickname of canaries. And while many women recovered from this discoloration with no major issues, some suffered from severe health problems related to it, namely a horrible liver malfunction known as jaundice. Throughout the war, an estimated 400 women came down with jaundice, and around 100 people died from it. In addition to the yellowing of the skin, sufferers reported frequent headaches, nausea, hives, and other side effects. Investigators discovered that there were 2 different types of symptoms that came along with exposure to TNT. Irritative symptoms, which were mostly superficial and consisted of things like skin and digestive irritation, and toxic symptoms, including jaundice, nausea, dizziness, and constipation. The women who suffered more severe cases risked the chance of passing their illness on to their baby. Hundreds of so-called canary babies were born during World War I. For most, the condition faded with time. When it became clear that workers were suffering, factories were required to improve their ventilation systems and provide employees with masks. 3. Internment camps and German prisoners. Starting in 1915, England detained German civilians as so-called enemy aliens. An estimated 30,000 Germans were held at internment camps throughout the UK. In the meantime, English, French, and Russians were detained at camps in Germany. When the United States entered the war, German nationals living in the US were classified as enemy aliens. According to then-President Woodrow Wilson's orders, German-born male residents over the age of 14 all fell under the qualifying criteria for being labeled as aliens, even if they'd gained US citizenship. Starting in 1917, around 250,000 so-called enemy aliens had to register their status at their local post office. They were given an identification card, which they had to carry at all times, and they were required to report any changes in address or employment. Women were required to do the same starting the following year in 1918. Altogether, around 500,000 people were registered as enemy aliens. Thousands of German Americans were interrogated, and approximately 6,000 were imprisoned for the rest of the war. Most of the prisoners were sent to either Fort Douglas, Utah, or Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The detainees contained a sizable number of intellectuals, including 29 members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and renowned geneticist Richard Goldschmidt. Life was strict at the internment camps. Some prisoners took their own lives, dozens were transferred to asylums, and there were occasional outbreaks of various diseases. But the prisoners made their existences as bearable as possible. Those with valuable skills and knowledge to pass on held courses that their fellow prisoners could take, teaching things like biology, mathematics, languages, and literature. Musicians played and performed together to keep the morale up, and the detainees at several camps turned their surroundings into makeshift German villages. Most civilian detainees were released by 1919, and they had to start their lives over from scratch because the government had seized $500 million worth of their personal property and assets when they were taken prisoner. Regardless of how trivial the charges against a person were, or the fact that they might even be innocent of the allegations they were facing, chances are they lost anything of value that they once owned. The US government defended its decision by claiming that taking people's belongings and property prevented them from being able to financially support the country's enemies. Even the wives of German and Austro-Hungarian immigrants were considered enemy aliens and lost an estimated $25 million of property combined. It may surprise you to learn that the Bayer Aspirin Company became a casualty of the massive seizure when it was sold on the steps of its own building in New York. In early 1917, US authorities began detaining German commercial vessels and their crews at American ports. As a result, over 2,000 Germans were held as prisoners of war at a hotel in Hot Springs, North Carolina. The US military began taking German military prisoners long before civilians were targeted. In 1914, the Imperial German Navy vessel the Cormoran pulled into the harbor at Guam in search of fuel and provisions. The American military members stationed there gave the captain two choices: return to sea without enough fuel and supplies, or be detained at Guam. Wanting to avoid an ill-prepared encounter with the Japanese, the captain opted to stay on the island. The US officially cut diplomatic ties with Germany in early 1917 after repeated U-boat attacks on American shipping fleets bound for Europe. At that point, the 353 surviving German military detainees at Guam were sent to the US mainland. Crew members aboard the German cruiser Gaia had a similar experience when they sought refuge from the Japanese at Honolulu in 1914. They were detained, but didn't become official prisoners of war until early 1917. To avoid being destroyed by US Navy vessels in the Atlantic, crew members of the German cruisers Prinz Eitel Friedrich and Kronprinz Wilhelm stayed in various Virginia ports and lived on the ships for several years. They were occasionally allowed to spend time on shore and were eventually given permission to build their own settlement on land. The collection of simple, single-room houses became known as Germantown. It eventually grew to include cafes, a police station, churches, and vegetable gardens. Residents rescued farm animals and also had pets. But they were still prisoners, and when 9 men escaped the encampment in early 1917, the remaining 750 were sent to the more restrictive confines of actual detention camps, where they were kept separate from civilian detainees. Would you try to escape if you were taken as a prisoner of war? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. Radium Girls. The United States entered World War I in April of 1917, almost 3 years after it began. Just like in Britain, many women volunteered to work in support of the war effort. One of the main employers was the US Radium Corporation USRC plant in Orange, New Jersey, where women painted watch dials with self-luminous paint. The paint contained a toxic radioactive substance called radium. It was first identified in the late 19th century by Pierre and Marie Curie, who knew from the beginning that they were working with a hazardous material. One of the main indicators of this were the burns Marie suffered to her hands while handling it. Her husband, Pierre, was reportedly afraid of going near even a small amount of it because he feared that it would burn his skin off or render him blind. The Curies worked with pure radium, and at the time, it was widely believed that the substance was harmless or even good for health in small amounts. Throughout the early 20th century, it became trendy to drink radium-infused water and to use radium-infused toothpaste and cosmetics. People were attracted to its luminescent quality, which made their skin and teeth look brighter. But radium is extremely dangerous, especially when ingested, and the owners and scientists at USRC were well aware of the hazards of coming into direct contact with it. They also knew that the damage could have a cumulative effect over time. And while male workers were given lead aprons to protect themselves from radium, female employees received no protection. They were even told to put their paintbrushes to their lips to get the bristles to form a fine point, because using rags and water would cost more time and materials. Thinking the paint was harmless, the women who worked at the plant handled it without taking any precautions. They even used it to paint their nails and add some glow to their hair, faces, and lips. Women continued to work with radium even after the war. At its peak, the plant in New Jersey employed around 300 female workers. The effects of coming into constant contact with radium eventually began to appear. In 1922, worker Molly Maggia went to the dentist with a toothache. The pain didn't go away, so the dentist pulled several more teeth and Molly's wounds wouldn't heal. She eventually underwent jaw surgery, only for the dentist to realize that her bone was so weak that it crumbled almost as soon as he touched it. Radiation had sucked all the calcium out of Molly's bones, and she also had tumors. Her entire jaw was removed, and she died 8 months after she got her first toothache. Around the same time, another so-called radium girl's spine collapsed, while others suffered from cataracts, skin and throat cancer, tooth and hair loss, and other symptoms of prolonged exposure to radiation. Just like people thought radium was harmless in small amounts, company executives later said that they thought female workers were at far lower risk of severe health effects than their male co-workers because they were handling much less of it. People began suing USRC, and company officials initially denied that radium was responsible for the women's health problems and deaths. They were happy to go along with it when a coroner's jury, which was made up of laypersons, blamed syphilis for Molly Maggia's death. The company also paid for a study that determined in their favor that radium wasn't the problem. Renowned pathologist Harrison Marland investigated the matter for himself and found damning evidence that radiation poisoning was, in fact, the cause of many cases of cancer and other deadly ailments among USRC's radium girls. The ensuing court and medical costs drove the company into financial ruin. No amount of money could stop most of the girls from suffering for years with severe health issues before enduring an excruciating death. The main good thing that came out of the ordeal was the widespread attention that was drawn to the effects of radiation, which led to heightened safety protocols and more oversight when it came to ensuring that standards were being followed. 1. Conscientious objectors. A conscientious objector is someone who chooses not to engage in armed conflict for personal, moral, or religious reasons. During World War I, around 16,000 conscientious objectors opted not to fight. The No Conscription Fellowship was established in Britain in late 1914, several months after the war broke out. Founded by Fenner Brockway, it was dedicated to opposing the introduction of compulsory military service. Thanks to the group's efforts, something called the Conscience Clause was added to the Military Service Act in 1916. This gave conscientious objectors a chance to argue their case against service, with a chance of being excused from it. Most of these 16,000 men who fought for exemption were denied and conscripted into service. Nearly 10,000 of them were allowed to serve as non-combatants in the Non-Combatant Corps, which was formed in 1916. While some conscientious objectors' fellow service members were open-minded to their point of view, others found it disrespectful and inexcusable not to follow orders to fight. They definitely faced harsher treatment than most soldiers and were often considered cowards or seen as shirking their military duties, even though many put themselves right in the line of fire to help their wounded fellow soldiers. Around 6,000 conscientious objectors, known as absolutists, refused to comply with their military orders and were arrested and court-martialed. They were all sentenced to prison time. Inmates were required to stay silent, effectively putting them into solitary confinement. In addition to being maddening, the conditions were unpleasant in numerous other ways. The food was meager, morale was low, and the beds were thin. Men who weren't young and in good shape were especially uncomfortable and prone to physical suffering. Conscientious objectors received extra harsh treatment from guards and were deprived of medical care. At least 70 died in custody or after being released for issues stemming from their time in prison. Things got even worse for some absolutists when the so-called Home Office scheme was introduced in July of 1916. It gave conscientious objectors an opportunity to work at labor camps throughout Britain in lieu of prison time. But some saw any activity under the Military Service Act as government service and therefore refused to participate. Others decided that it was the best alternative to having to serve in the military and took up on the offer. The labor camps weren't the perfect solution to the problem, and for several reasons. In addition to still qualifying as government work in the eyes of some conscientious objectors, there was corruption at the camps, and some even compared the work to slave labor. All conscientious objectors who refused to serve the military in any capacity were released from custody by August of 1919, nearly 9 months after the war ended. Their status followed them around in their civilian lives, making it difficult for them to find decent work or return to the lives they led before the war. Thanks for watching. Would you like to learn more secrets about the world wars? Tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.